Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this evening's program. Please let me know in the chat if you have any trouble hearing me. My name is Laura Langer. I'm the Assistant Director of Development at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, neighbors with the Mark Twain House and Museum. And I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's program on behalf of the Stowe Center and the Twain House. Tonight, we are welcoming Dorothy Wickenden and Manisha Sinha for a discussion of Dorothy's new book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. I'm going to introduce our two lovely guests in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for the event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away last year. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and CT Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you as the audience can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guest discussion tonight, and we encourage you to do so. We will also be posting the link to purchase a signed copy of The Agitators from the Mark Twain store. Getting your copy through our store not only gets you a signed copy of the book, but also benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. If you have a specific question for either Dorothy or Manisha, you can go ahead and post that directly into the Ask a Question section. It should be to the left of the chat, right under the green bar at the bottom of your screen. While we're on the topic of that green bar, if you're enjoying the program this evening and would like to make a donation to help us do more of these events in the future, you can go ahead and give it a click to lend your support. Donations from this evening's event will be split evenly between the Mark Twain House Museum and the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Now that I've said all that, I'm going to formally introduce our guests for tonight's program. Our moderator, Dr. Manisha Sinha, is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction. She was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015, and recently featured in the New York Times 1619 Project. Her second monograph, award-winning The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and named Editor's Choice in the New York Times Book Review. Dr. Sinha also taught at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst for over 20 years, where she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest recognition bestowed on faculty, and she is currently writing a book on greater reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, and is a current 2022 Guggenheim Fellow. Dorothy Wickenden tonight is here to discuss her book, The Agitators. She is also the author of Nothing Daunted, The Unexpected Education of Two Society Girls in the West. And she has been the executive editor of The New Yorker since January 1996. Dorothy also writes for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, The Political Scene. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, Wickenden has has been the National Affairs Editor at Newsweek from 1993 to 95, and before that was a longtime executive editor at The New Republic. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to both Dorothy and Manisha. I'm going to sit back and enjoy this conversation, and I'll return for Q&A at the end of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara, for that introduction. So I am delighted to be here today in conversation with you, Dorothy, on your wonderful new book, The Agitators. You know, I know the history of abolition and the early women's rights movement well, having researched and written a book on abolition myself. But I was really taken by your beautifully written and deeply researched book. So just to get us started off, I wanted to ask you about your motivation for writing the book. In your acknowledgments, you describe growing up in upstate New York, writing about your own grandmother and her sister from Auburn, New York, and how you stumbled upon the story of these extraordinary three women: Harriet Tubman, Frances Seward, the abolitionist wife of William Henry Seward, anti-slavery governor and senator of New York, and of course, Lincoln's Secretary of State, and Martha Coffin Wright, the sister of the Quaker abolitionist Lucretia Mott, who was present at Seneca Falls and became a leading women's rights activist in her own right. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your motivation for writing this story. You know, you came of age at the height of second wave feminism and the rise of women's history as a field of study. Was there something about the stories of these three pioneering abolitionist feminists, I would call them, that really spoke to your own beliefs and ideals?
Yes, absolutely. And there were a couple of motivations, I think. First, I went to college in upstate New York, Hobart and William Smith colleges, and one of my professors there had taken me to Seneca Falls to see the museum there. And so that was kind of and I learned a little bit when I was there about the history of radicalism in upstate New York. So that was kind of the early background to it. But then when I was working on my first book about my grandmother who grew up in Auburn, New York, right near Seneca Falls, and I had never been there before, and I went for the first time to do a little research. And one of the things she had said in her oral history, which my mother took, was that her grandparents had grown up next to the Sewards in Auburn. And so it was really a fact-checking mission. So I went to the Seward House Museum and I said, is it true that the Woodruffs lived next door? And the director said, yes, absolutely. And he pointed out where it was right through William Seward's study window. But then I was taken in hand by this young woman. She couldn't have been more than 30, who was the education director there. And she said, let me give you a private tour. And she took me down a very narrow set of dark stairs, which were the stairs into the original basement kitchen and dining room of the house. And it's set up now to show visitors that this was where Frances Seward, the wife of William H. Seward, hid fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. So I had never heard of Frances Seward. Of course, you always hear about the great statesman, William H. Seward. But this young woman was very animated. The whole tour, she didn't want to talk about William Seward. She wanted to talk about Frances Seward, who was an invalid. The Seward's biographers, who were all men until Doris Kearns Goodwin included some of that in her book, Team of Rivals. They all of these male biographers dismissed Frances Seward as a neurotic invalid, essentially, who was spent all her time, sort of nursing her headaches in her bedroom. But the story I got from this young woman was totally different. She said, she was a radical. She was much more radical than her husband. And she conspired with this very good friend of hers around the corner, Martha Coffin Wright, who was a Quaker and just a complete rebel from birth. And both of them were very early advocates of women's rights, very anti-slavery, quickly became abolitionists at the very, birth of the abolitionist movement in America. And then along came Harriet Tubman some years later. And so this was the first time I'd heard any of this. And I said, Harriet Tubman? I knew she had been born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I thought, how did she end up in this industrial city in upstate New York? And this young woman said, oh, yes, and she lived just a mile down the road on this very grand boulevard in Auburn, which you would have thought was a completely, unintegrated city, very conservative city for the most part. So I was finishing this book about my grandmother, but I couldn't get this story out of my mind. And when I was there, I was told by one of the descendants of my grandmother's best friend, who also plays a major role in that book, that the stories she had grown up with were that my grandmother and her best friend, from the time they were in kindergarten, were standing on South Street across from the Seward house, which was just a house at the time and not a museum. And this was probably in the late 1890s, maybe a little bit later. and they saw Harriet Tubman pass by. And that story too, I just thought my grandmother's life coincided, Harriet Tubman by then was of course a very old woman, but it made me realize how short American history is and how much action and dynamic, rebellion is packed into those years. So as I was finishing the work on Nothing Daunted, I began just in the back of my mind thinking about this story. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, this is a book that no one had ever thought to write before, and I threw myself into it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, American history is, in a way, so recent, if you think about it. And some of those issues and some of those legacies are still so much with us that it's, quite amazing. But, going on from there, I was just thinking, one of the great strengths of the book is how you interweave the sort of personal lives and public commitments of all three women, right? The constraints of 19th century marriage, childbearing and rearing, household duties for Frances and Martha, and the heartbreak of Tubman's first marriage in slavery. So, was that purposeful in describing these sorts of limits that were imposed on women's lives then? In a way, Harriet is the one who is able to flout gender conventions best. I mean, there's a reason why John Brown calls her General Tubman and refers to her only with masculine pronouns. But I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a bit about that, because I thought the book really did that quite wonderfully.
Thank you. And yes, what I tried to do essentially was write an inside-out history of that period, and it really spanned, the decade leading into the Civil War, the years of the Civil War, and then the years immediate afterward. And so there was a lot of history to cover, but I decided I wanted to tell it from the voices of people who were considered beneath notice and were thought to be, therefore, not remotely dangerous because they had no political power at all. And I just thought that whole idea was so interesting. And I've always been interested in how radical social movements form and how people come together in them. And I remember talking to a historian early on, and I said, I want to tell in part the history of the Underground Railroad and how it worked with people, crossing lines of race and gender to overturn this, founding institution in American so-called democracy. And this woman said, I just don't think you'll be able to do it. So that was a little discouraging, but I realized once I started reading the letters in the archives that Frances Seward wrote to her husband, and she wrote almost on the average of 3 to 4 times a week because she stayed in Auburn which was very radical in itself, while he went to Washington as a senator and ultimately as Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln. Her letters were absolutely revelatory, both about what women's lives were like at home and how they had no rights at all. They were property. According to the law, they're the property of their husbands, as was any money they inherited. And then Martha Coffin Wright, I went to look at her amazing letters. She wrote all the time to her older sister, Lucretia Mott, whom you mentioned. Lucretia was 14 years older, so in effect, she was a second mother to Martha. And so imagine growing up with that powerhouse as an older sister who was basically schooling her in the arts of revolution from a very young age. And so Martha she had 6 young children. She hated being stuck at home with them. She was a very good housekeeper, but she resented the fact that she was expected to do all of the childcare, all of the housework. And it was, imagine in those days, before electricity, before indoor plumbing, all of the rest of it. And again, all of the details, these incredible details, which historians have traditionally overlooked because after all, they were about women and how, what interest could they possibly be? But you learn all kinds of things like Martha talking about changing the straw in the mattresses. That was one duty. How it took her 3 hours to bathe her 3 youngest children one day. How she got up before dawn and was still working at midnight, long after her husband, who was a local lawyer, had gone to bed. And yet she found a way to overturn these conventions and these laws. And the most remarkable thing, when I began putting these lives together, And Harriet Tubman, who was quite a bit younger than the other two, and found her way to Auburn through Martha's older sister, Lucretia, because Lucretia lived in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was where Harriet Tubman first fled when she liberated herself from slavery. And so I began to learn exactly what I wanted to learn. How did these activists on the Underground Railroad get to know each other and work? And this was an organization, as you well know, that lasted some 40 to 50 years with very few betrayals. And it wasn't, these were not just white upper class abolitionists. And you point this out in your book. There were enslaved people, there were free blacks, there were male merchants, there were housewives. I mean, it was just a cross section of American society who had decided that slavery was just abhorrent. It was an evil. Many of them were guided by religious beliefs, and it was unspeakable, and they had to do something about it. So Lucretia Mott had created a haven for fugitive slaves in her house in Philadelphia. Martha did the same in her basement kitchen in Auburn, New York. And then once Frances lived in her father's house, who was a very conservative judge. But once he died, she did inherit. By then, women were able to inherit their own property, and she inherited the house from her father, and it was hers. And so she turned that former basement kitchen into a stop on the Underground Railroad too. So when Harriet Tubman came through Auburn, she got to know both of these women, immediately trusted them. Harriet Tubman, among many extraordinary qualities, just had a very keen instinct for whom she could trust and whom she couldn't. And so she was extremely selective in her contacts and brilliant. She made very few mistakes. And she developed this relationship with these women, and they saw her. So on the surface, you would think, well, what did these women have in common? This Quaker, housewife, this aristocratic wife of one of the biggest statesmen in American history, and a fugitive slave. I think they had more in common than they had with their own husbands. And as you say, Harriet Tubman, she went off on her own. She had hoped, when she made her first expedition back into the South, her very first expedition was to bring her free African-American husband back with her. He had been too afraid to go with her. When she left by herself, he thought she would fail. They would be killed. It was impossible. She, of course, completely succeeded. She got a job. She got a place to live in Philadelphia. She went back with great excitement 2 years later with a brand new set of clothes for him, got word to him that she was in the area, and she was told that he had taken another wife, and it just about destroyed her. But she decided, she told one of her other friends in the North, a friend in Boston, where she also made some extremely important friends. She said, I just cast him out of my heart. And instead, she said, I wanted to go in and make all the trouble I could, but she decided, no, that would be foolish, and for temper to make mischief, as she said. So instead, she found some people who did want to go north and did want to be freed, and she took them with her. And that was the beginning of her rebellion and her decision that she was going to devote the rest of her life to civil rights, basically. And she would start by being an active member of this amazing movement in America.
Yes, the book is really a triple biography, right? And I think it evokes the sort of a sisterhood of women's activism in the 19th century really well, but also the interracialism of abolition, which I think for a long time had been downplayed by historians and also, independent scholars. So just to go further into the book and these three fascinating stories, I was taken by your description of William Henry Seward and Frances Seward's sort of long companionate marriage. I mean, it fits into that 19th century notion of a companionate marriage. And, she was always known as Seward's abolitionist wife. I knew that, most historians studying that knew that. But you really flesh out her independent activism. And it seemed to me really as if Seward's greatest anti-slavery moments, his defense of freemen, the Black man accused of murdering a white family in Auburn, his higher law speech during the Compromise of 1850 debates, come when Francis seems to have the greatest influence on him. His growing conservatism during the war, especially after it, in Johnson's cabinet, comes after her death in 1866. So instead of concentrating on William Seward, I was wondering where and how his political ambitions may have even constrained Frances' activism at points. What about her influence on him? Would you like to speculate on that?
Yes, and you're absolutely right about all of that. And it was this interesting marriage in the beginning of she married when she was 19. She was just a naive girl. She didn't really know anything. She had some sort of idealistic beliefs, but that was that. And so in the early years, she looked up to him. He was her guide in political matters. She did not like politics as, traditional politics. He early on decided that was going to be his profession. She was extremely distressed. But once he had made that decision, she effectively became his private political advisor. And yes, she was much more radical than he was, which I have to say is easier if you're outside the power system. You are completely shut out, and you are enraged by that, and you have nothing much to lose. And he did. Unlike Martha, who went out and spoke in public, and unlike Harriet Tubman, who also gave lectures and also went back down, risked her life every time she went back into the Eastern Shore. Frances did it. She was very shy, recessive. She did have bad health. So she did it essentially all through her husband. And you can see this vividly in this very animated correspondence that they kept up. They really respected each other. He did believe in women's rights, absolutely. But when she was in Washington, which was a city where slavery was legal, it was highly stratified. It was a Southern city where Southerners held sway. He was way, considered a radical himself. So he tried to work within the power system. And she just increasingly, as the years went on, especially after she got to know Harriet Tubman, and she saw the effects of slavery on people, and she heard Harriet's stories, and she read these abolitionist newspapers. She and Martha got to know Frederick Douglass, and so the network of radical abolitionists and feminists, or as they called themselves at the time, women's rights advocates, was tiny. There were very few people who thought the way they did. It was an incredibly dangerous way to think. And so Seward kept thinking, well, I can, if he respected abolitionists, he respected the fact that Frances ran the, an Underground Railroad station from their house. He complimented her on it. He thought it was good because it got her out of her, her slumps, her medical slumps. But she began to really bridle at the fact that when she was in Washington, she had to act like a traditional politician's wife. She had nothing in common with these Southern women. She didn't have anything to talk to them about. She thought she's a bit of a snob, and certainly she liked to talk on very lofty levels, and she liked to talk about what she was interested in. And certainly these Southern women weren't interested in hearing about women's rights and about overturning slavery. But she had to. And so he would tell her what she wanted to join. She wanted to, there was a very close relationship between British women and American women who were working to overturn slavery. And so there was a letter at one point that was going to be, actually it was after Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published. And the women in Britain were just completely energized by that, as of course were millions of people in America and elsewhere. And they sent a letter to the women of America, and they invited them to join them, to sign this petition to overturn slavery in America. And Frances wanted to do it, and she wrote to her sister, I think if it were up to me, I would do this. And do you think we should join these women? I think we should. And then she said, but I know Henry, as she called her husband, would never allow me to do so. So eventually she did, because you were, as a wife, you were expected to be loyal, you had to serve your role, and it took her 9 years, but eventually she told him, that's it, I can't live in Washington even for a few months a year. I'm going back to Auburn. I'm going to live my own life. I'm going to be the kind of person I want to be. And effectively, they saw each other a couple times a year after that, although they were writing and there was a lot of affection, but the stresses were definitely there. So again, he respected her up to a point, but he was furious when she resigned as his hostess. And he wrote a very angry letter, but now I have to find somebody else to do all your duties. But Seward, interestingly, he was such a deft politician. So he knew he could only go so far in Washington. And he had these very elaborate parties where he invited members of both parties, his worst enemies, Jefferson Davis and Verena Davis. He constantly invited them to his house for these dinners, thinking that he could cajole them with his charm. And of course, that did not work. But he also maintained correspondences with all of the best known abolitionists. Frederick Douglass wrote him frequently, as did abolitionists in Concord and Boston, really all over the North. And they were all constantly saying, you are the most powerful, eventually Republican, radical Republican. You have to speak out more overtly against slavery. And he spoke out pretty overtly for a man of his time and even of his party. It wasn't enough for the abolitionists. And so he wrote back to one of them in Boston. He said, you have to let me do it in my own way, in my own time. I need you to go out and spread the word through the pulpit and the streets. And once public opinion has kind of come with you, then I can propose bills in Congress. And so for me, it was a really interesting way to think about how power, the different ways that power asserts itself everywhere, actually. I mean, you see it in Ukraine right now. You can do it. You can do it from either from behind the scenes or through outright rebellion. But if you are a part of the power center, which was then all white, all men, you could only go so far without being thrown out. So he had all kinds of rationales for working the way he did, and you see this. And so he and Francis are constantly having this argument in their letters, and it's just totally revelatory, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think of politics, we'd never associate radical social movements like abolition with actually moving the pendulum in pre-Civil War America. And you can see this, I think you say rightly, in both personal and political alliances between abolitionists and anti-slavery Republican. In fact, one can't imagine the emergence of an anti-slavery Republican Party without the abolitionist movement seeding the ground for like nearly 30 years before that. So at least that's what I argue in the slaves' cause. These were not irrelevant extremists. It's sort of interesting that you encapsulated that dialogue within their marriage between Francis and Henry Seward. And so I also wanted to, sort of move from there and get to another side of sort of abolitionist politics. One was, in fact, petitioning to Congress, making sure laws were being passed, agitating against the spread of slavery, trying to get rid of the slave trade, the domestic slave trade, etc., for which you needed politics, right? But there's another side to abolitionist activism, and that's like that on-the-ground activism that you described, associated with the Underground Railroad, in which Francis is more involved. And I really liked the way that in this book, you took Sarah Bradford's biography of Tubman sort of seriously, rather than just sort of dismissing it as the imagination of its white author, as many of Tubman's biographers have done. I mean, I think you show quite well how Tubman came up with the idea and how she controlled her narrative. So even though she's not writing it, we can hear her words in that biography, and you use it really well. And also Frederick Douglass's sort of wonderful tribute to her, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how difficult it was for you to sort of uncover Tubman's story in comparison to Francis and Martha? Even though we've had excellent recent biographies by Kate Clifford Larson and others, did you find it tough to sort of include her in this because the sources for her are so much more scanty?
Yes, absolutely. That was the hardest part of the book to write. It was also the most exciting to me. It took me 7 years to write the book. And a part of the challenge for all three women, but especially for Tubman, because there were no letters. She, of course, never had a chance to learn to read and write. And she had a very serious head injury from someone who threw an iron weight at another enslaved person, and it hit her in the head, and it caused some neurological damage. So she didn't leave any written record. And so I kept struggling with her voice and how should I tell her story? And I finally decided, and of course I read Kate Larson's biography and the other biographies, and Kate has done superb research, going back to court documents, and really has been doing this for 25 years now. She and I became friends. I got to know her, but so I learned so much from her book, but no one had really written this narrative of through the perspective of Harriet Tubman. And so it was sort of an audacious thing to do. But then I decided that actually Harriet Tubman was so prescient and so strategically brilliant. I am positive now that I know her much better, that she wanted to be remembered, and she wanted to be, and she left all the breadcrumbs for someone to pick up at one point and to tell her story as she would have liked it to have been told. So and the great thing was when she spoke, she made many friends, especially in Auburn and in Boston and Concord. And women in particular were riveted by her story because they could relate to it so much more immediately than white men could, for the most part, even white male abolitionists. And so they often wrote down her words almost verbatim, and they would do it in dialect and in ways that we today find objectionable. But they were accurate. And I could tell that because each account Harriet Tubman told the same stories, say, about her childhood and some of the abuse she suffered over and over again to different people. And enough people took down these accounts that I could match them up, and they were uncannily similar. So when Sarah Bradford, her first biographer, came around after the war, when Harriet Tubman had settled in Auburn, Bradford made no great claims for the book herself. It's this thin little biography, and she was on her way to Europe, and she was in a great rush, and she was a children's book author and so on. But she basically just took down Harriet Tubman's words. And so that's what I drew from. So when we came to the Civil War and this amazing chapter, my favorite chapter to write, when Harriet Tubman decided, she told Martha, who was Martha Coffin Wright, who was a good friend of hers by then. She told her, and this is what was fun about putting these three women together. And so Martha wrote about this, and she said to Lucretia, Harriet says that she's going off to South Carolina to do some kind of secret service, and she had no idea what Harriet Tubman was talking about. But when Tubman set out to do something, she did it. She got in with it for an audience with the governor of Massachusetts, whom she, through her abolitionist friends there. She got permission to go down to occupied South Carolina. She got herself known to all of the abolitionist generals down there in this little area, Beaufort and Port Royal. And quickly she made herself invaluable. They gave her money. These army generals gave her money to hire 8 scouts so that the scouts could go out, and locals who could go out and find all of the enemy positions that were surrounding them on 3 sides and report back about where the enemy was and what they were up to. It's just amazing. And then Harriet would report to the generals. She made herself so important that she was asked to go along on this very major river raid called the Combahee River Raid, where and again, they were going up the river, and they were going into areas that Confederates were still on their plantations, and they still had all their enslaved people working in the fields. And so they arranged these river raids, and Harriet Tubman was on the lead river boat, basically, taking part in the Civil War very soon after Black men had been allowed into the army. So this was just an astonishing thing for her to have done. And she told Sarah Bradford all about it. And she also wrote to an abolitionist friend in Boston who ran a newspaper there, and she dictated a letter to a friend and then sent it to Boston. And then he had this wonderful scoop. Harriet Tubman is in, South Carolina. So he published that. But basically what Sarah Bradford wrote and what I found in that newspaper account, they were the same. And so that's how you begin to, and then I went down there and I got to know this man who was self-educated and has lived there his entire life. He's spent decades studying the Combahee River raid. He'd written the book himself. He took me all around. And he went back to original sources, so I found more from him. So this was just really, really exciting. And then, she was 3 years there. And the other thing I found before she left, she had this very beloved, she had no children of her own, and she had a niece named Margaret, whom she had brought up and that's a very complicated story in itself, but she had brought from the Eastern Shore and settled her in the house that she had bought from Francis Seward on South Street in Auburn, New York. And before Harriet Tubman left for the war, she wanted to be sure that this niece, who was 10 years old, was well educated. And Harriet Tubman was absolutely convinced at a time when nobody else was that the North was going to win the war. And she wanted this young girl to be prepared to be a free woman in America, an educated woman. So she asked Frances to take care of her. And so Frances took her into her house. She taught her herself as she homeschooled her own daughter. She gave her a religious education. She taught her how to dress properly, how to speak properly, how to be what in the 19th century they thought was a proper young woman. So when Harriet Tubman came back 3 years later and saw this 13-year-old, she knew that Frances would take care of her as if she were her own daughter. So again, this story about female friendship and this political, shared political belief that they were enacting, as the revolution was taking place. It was really quite something. And the personal parts of these stories are so important because that's how history is made. It's not only made in the halls of Congress, as we well know.
Absolutely. And for these women to be able to trust each other with each other's children, and that how that abolitionist network spreads to the next generation with their children and the in-laws. It was really fascinating. And I have that sense too when I wrote The Slave's Cause, is I ended up writing a lot about marriages between abolitionists and, trying to educate a child in the abolition way. And it was interesting that they were pretty much doing that too. And I sort of love the way that you actually chart this a little bit with Martha Coffin Wright, her emergence in the women's movement. The book ends with Tubman, but you begin with the abolitionist Coffin family in Nantucket. Lucretia Mott, she's present at the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society. She's there at Seneca Falls with her sister, of course, and she's better known. But I think you really show how Martha Coffin Wright comes into her own, presiding over women's rights conventions in the 1850s. She leaves this legacy of women's activism, as her husband wonderfully tells her children, right? That hers is a legacy for you. So, can you, the thing that fascinated me about her is how she negotiated the Reconstruction split in the suffragist movement. And the Abolitionist Feminist Alliance. She disapproves of Stanton and Antony's alliance with racist Democrats in opposition to the 14th and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction, and yet chooses to stay with their organization rather than Lucy Stone's. So, since race became such a factor in that split, and I thought you did a great job in just describing that split very fairly. But do you think that split and the legacy of that lives on in American feminism today? And did Martha Wright sort of see that by, expressing her disapproval of Stanton and Antony's tactics in Kansas and their alliance with George Francis Train, and at the same time realizing that they are important for American feminism, and therefore I'm going to stick with that organization.
Yeah, and as you know, it's such an incredibly complicated sort of series of events, and it changed so much over the years. And a lot of that was after the sort of the scope of my book. But I totally agree with you that that was a very, very difficult moment for Martha. She was, so just to go back a little bit, at Seneca Falls in 1848, she was one of the organizers with Lucretia Mott and a couple of others, and with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She so admired. Stanton was a little bit younger than Martha. Martha was already a grandmother at age 41, and she was pregnant with her 7th child. She thought her life was over, essentially, except as a mother and grandmother. So she meets this young dynamo, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who just was ready to break out and just no holds barred. She, pushed past Lucretia at Seneca Falls. She insisted that one of the planks be, the vote, the women's right to vote, which Lucretia said, no way, no, it's just like way too early. And Stanton wouldn't listen to her. So Martha met her and was radicalized by her at Seneca Falls. And she also met Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass pulled her into abolitionism, became a very close friend. Martha always entertained him at her home, to the horror of her neighbors. She was pulled into feminism, to the women's rights movement, which was then just starting officially by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so she became one of Stanton's closest friends. And later on, when Susan B. Anthony joined them, they both looked to Martha as the pragmatist. She was very funny, very smart, although she stopped her education at age 15. And they were firebrands, and they were throwing bombs, and they had all kinds of crazy ideas. And Martha would say, well, we can go this far, but not that far. And so they always looked to her for her good sense. So years later, when this moment of truth comes, when, as you say, with the Reconstruction amendments, and before that as well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had become so attached to their cause. It was to the exclusion of everything else, even though they were such close friends with all of these abolitionists, and they believed in abolition. They had fought for the 13th Amendment. They had suspended the women's rights movements during the war, against Susan B. Anthony's better judgment, and they did launch this huge petition campaign. You talked about petition, how important that was. They made their alliance with Charles Sumner in Congress. That was an incredible thing that they did. It was quite successful. But then the 14th and 15th Amendments came along, and it became clear to them that women were not going to be given the same rights that Black men were going to be given. And by far the most abolitionists, including Lucretia Mott and Martha Coffin Wright, thought that if you couldn't get the vote, and it was going to be hard to get the vote for Black men, but if you couldn't get the vote for both for Black men and for women, then you should go for the vote for Black men because of the atrocities that were taking place in the South after the Civil War. And Martha absolutely believed that. So did Lucretia. Lucretia split with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton when they just refused. They were saying, the vote for all or the vote for none. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And it was racist. And this George Francis Train, who was kind of an early Trumpist, subsidized their newspaper. And they wrote all these appalling things. And Martha was just aghast. And her husband said, what are you going to do? And she said, sadly, well, I believe in standing by my friends, even when they do unwise things. So she wrote to them, tried to convince them not to do it. Lucy Stone begged her to join her organization rather than theirs, and she wouldn't do it. It was just out of pure loyalty to her friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a really difficult thing to negotiate, I'm sure, for her. Between it's actually one of those sad stories actually about how
one of the thing I have to add is that Frederick Douglass, who was her close friend as well, was absolutely horrified, as he should have been, and he just gave a withering speech at a convention against Elizabeth Cady Stanton in particular and Susan B. Anthony. And Martha wrote to her husband, just I thought Fred Douglass's speech "V good," and I just thought that that was very revealing.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the old abolitionist feminists like Stone or Abby Kelly Foster,
Yeah.
this was something that they would never excuse, that kind of blatant racism that they adopted, whether strategically or just from a sliver of elitism, that was in their thought. But we've had a great conversation, and I had many more questions for you, but unfortunately our time is up, and we have to sort of open it up to questions from the audience. So I'm going to let Lara moderate and tell us if we have some questions for you from the audience that you'd like to answer. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll jump right in. The first question is, what are some of the creative, lesser-known forms of rebellion during abolition?
Sorry, repeat the question. Just I'm trying to think how to answer that one. And maybe Manisha will be able to do it better than I. But
well, it's what are the more creative forms of rebellion during abolition? If you think about it, well, I would suggest, in my book, in the Slave Scores, A History of Abolition, one of the reasons why it's such a big book is because I try to include all those different forms of resistance, abolitionist resistance. And women came up with very creative ways of resisting slavery. So you had women who would sew handkerchiefs or bags and say, "May the use of our needle prick your conscience," and they would sew that and sell it at an anti-slavery bazaar. They, besides writing, fiction, nonfiction, oratory, and this was all, of course, controversial, women taking on a public role. But the material culture of abolition, I thought, was really interesting. Even the sort of didactic stuff that they did in terms of juvenile literature. Women at this time are being educated, as Dorothy shows in her book. A lot of these women whom she discusses are actually going to women's schools and being some educated, though they don't have all the professions open to them, clearly. But a lot of these teachers have choirs that sing anti-slavery songs. They have, juvenile journals, etc. So I think women, Black and white, contribute to abolitionism. Its material culture, its literature and other ways, quite well. And when Tubman wrote her narrative, I guess she was doing, or had her dictated her narrative, she was doing something that a lot of Black men and women, whom I call fugitive slave abolitionists, like Douglas is merely the most famous of them, did. So yeah, they had really good ways of resisting.
Thank you. Okay, this question is from Donna. I first read a work of historical fiction about Sarah Grimke, a very early woman abolitionist who also began to speak out for women's rights. Does Grimke figure into your history?
Grimke does figure into my history, but she probably, Manisha's written at greater length that they were amazing sisters from Charleston, South Carolina. But again, I want to hear Manisha talk a little bit about some of these relatively unknown figures. And I will say also that a biography by a friend of mine is being written. So there is that work of fiction about the two sisters, but there's also a biography being written, a new biography being written about them.
Yes, I think Sarah and Angelina Grimke are just, they're a lot like Lucretia and Martha, because there's a huge age gap between them, and Sarah is virtually a maternal figure for Angelina. And Sarah is writing for women's rights quite early, but it's Angelina who really gets into the middle of the abolitionist fight. She becomes an orator. She gets married to Theodore Well. They have an abolitionist wedding with all these abolitionists attending, and it's really interesting to see how the Grimke sisters, I think, pioneering abolitionist feminists, and they're preceded, in fact, by some African American women like Maria Stewart, who actually spoke out in public. Is the first American woman to speak out in public. before Angelina. But it's Angelina's lecture tours that become very controversial. And it becomes a turning point in the abolitionist movement in terms of defending women's public role within abolition. So I think the Grimke sisters are extremely important, like Margaret Fuller. She's another person who comes to mind. Before even the rise of these women's rights conventions, you had abolitionist women and anti-slavery women like Fuller who were really writing very thoughtfully about women's rights. And if you look at Cady, Stanton's, they have a constructed history of the suffrage movement in which they tend to belittle Lucy Stone and some of the abolitionist feminists I like. But they mention all these women who preceded them. And the fact that it emerged from the abolition movement, I think is really important.
And just to punctuate one point there too, because it's so important, and I don't think we've devoted enough time to that. Black women were so important in these early years. So the American Anti-Slavery Society originally wouldn't allow, when they had their first meeting in 1833 in Philadelphia, they wouldn't allow women to be part of it. And the Grimke sisters were good friends of Lucretia Mott's, and Lucretia Mott had wanted to take part, and she was invited to listen, but not to speak. And she actually insisted on speaking. It caused a big fuss. So she was told, no, you can't, women can't join the society. So she and her African-American friends in Philadelphia, with whom she socialized and conspired every day, started a female anti-slavery society. And there was a Black female anti-slavery society in Salem, and there was one in Boston. And pretty soon, many of them were integrated, and pretty soon they became national meetings. And so this was way before Seneca Falls. So it's just important for people to realize that this was happening on many different levels in many different parts of the North. And of course, the Grimke sisters were particularly interesting because they came from a slaveholding family of many children, very aristocratic family, and both of them turned against it, and they became Quakers.
Right, and abolitionists, and I think people don't realize that Black women sort of led in forming these female anti-slavery societies. You mentioned the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society, and Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, actually writes in the Liberator, and he says, their white American sisters can learn from them a little bit about anti-slavery organizing, and then soon after you have the Boston and Philadelphia female and New York female anti-slavery societies. But this women's activism goes way back. It goes back to the Revolutionary era, to Phyllis Wheatley's poems, to other pioneering Quaker abolitionists, Elizabeth Hayrick, who's writing about immediate abolition in the 1820s. So women's activism within abolition is really important. And so you have these great instances where Mary Wollstonecraft writes one of the most first favorable reviews of Olaudah Equiano's slave narrative in the 18th century. And then Margaret Fuller does the same for Frederick Douglass in the 19th. So this linking of women's rights and Black rights is really, it's an old alliance within the abolition movement. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Next question by Jim. Do you think the fact that the wives were considered, quote, property created a kinship between them and slaves fueling the abolitionist movement? If so, do you have examples of this type of kinship?
Well, I write a lot about that, in the book, because I do believe that we can see the direct influence of a fugitive slave, Harriet Tubman, on these women. And also men. She spoke across New York State and in Boston as a way of raising money for her expeditions to the South in the 1850s. And when people, saw and listened to this Black woman, Harriet Tubman was incredibly savvy. She often spoke, and sometimes she spoke in private houses too, but when she was speaking to white women, she spoke to them a little bit differently often than she did to crowds with audiences that were men and women both. And she talked about how she went back for her husband, and she turned it into a joke, even though it was the most painful personal experience of her life. She wanted these white women who, obviously they had husbands who were philanderers and probably did all kinds of terrible things. And she wanted them to see what she had done. She had done what they never would have the courage to do, which was, go off on her own and enact her beliefs in a way that was, just literally unheard of. So the women just had this natural, I think, even upper class women had this visceral connection when they came across fugitive slaves, and a number of fugitive slaves spoke in the South, and they gave generously, to them, either to fund their trips further north, or, as in Harriet Tubman's case, to fund her rescue operations.
Yeah. I mean, women were not property as such. They just didn't have any legal standing, right? They couldn't own property if they were married. And, Dorothy talks about this in her book. I talk about it in mine, about how in the North, increasingly you have these Married Women's Property Acts being passed, how women's rights activists are demanding equality in law, and also demanding that they have some rights over their children, over their own property, etc. But I think it's really important to remember that a lot of these abolitionist women, were cognizant of their oppressions, but they always said that this was nothing compared to what enslaved people went through, or enslaved mothers had to go through. They were very careful about that. Angelina Grimke says, in fighting for the slaves' rights, I discovered that I myself was oppressed. But she distinguishes between her oppressions and the sort of greater oppressions of the slaves. And I think that's something that Stanton and Anthony, who are not directly coming out of the abolition movement. I mean, Anthony becomes a lecturer for the Anti-Slavery Society in the end, and Stanton is invited as a guest. But unlike these abolitionist women who've been so embroiled with that struggle, they are far more focused on women's rights alone, especially after the war. And so I think that there's a slight difference there. They didn't see themselves as property as such, though they resented the fact that they had absolutely no legal standing, and certainly did not have the right to vote. Yeah.
Did Martha, Frances, or Harriet meet and know Amelia Bloomer?
I do not. I never came across any evidence that they did. They must have known about her. I guess it's likely that Martha could have, because Bloomer knew Susan B. Anthony, and knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Didn't I'm now just blanking. I think that didn't Stanton. Yeah. You know.
So we call the Bloomer costume those pantaloons that women wore instead of the dress. And remember, Dorothy, you have this in your book. You talk about how Harriet Tubman doesn't want these skirts. I mean, she wants the Bloomer costume when she's scouting for the Union Army. But Stanton adopted it. Lucy Stone adopted it. But interestingly enough, what was known as the Bloomer's costume was not invented by Amelia Bloomer. It was actually invented by Gerrit Smith, who was an abolitionist, his daughter, Elizabeth Smith Miller. But Amelia Bloomer popularized it, and they published this magazine called The Lily, which was a temperance and women's rights magazine. So it became associated with her, the Bloomer costume. But a lot of women's rights activists adopted it. And at one point, both Lucy Stone and Anthony decide we're not going to wear it because it aroused so much derision against them that they decided, even though it was much more convenient, that they were just not going to wear it anymore.
Yeah, and they already got enough grief from daring to speak in public. So to dress in that way, they just enough, and it was too distracting.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question. The Stowe Center has been offering these workshops that we call craftivism, and they're inspired by the 19th century protocol of sewing bees, these activist sewing bee circles. And I just wondered how that type of group, that organized type of way for women to get together, fed into your own research, or how it affected the women that you were writing about. And I wondered a little bit more about those particular circles, and, did they do more than, talk with each other? I know they set up protesting and calls, and I'm just would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on these groups.
Well, and they had fairs every year, with crafts fairs, as Manisha mentioned earlier. And actually, Harriet Tubman, with those in mind, after the war, she came back and she from South Carolina, and she wanted to continue to work and raise money for all those 10,000 liberated slaves who needed everything: food, clothing, shelter, everything. So she was a great organizer, as we know. She convinced all of her friends in Auburn, the Sewards, Martha in particular, all of them, she organized a fair in 1868. And that was when her biography, when Sarah Bradford was writing her biography, she finished the biography in time for the Christmas fair. Martha, writes about, Harriet's got me, sewing and other people baking cakes, and used one of Martha's daughter's houses as a drop-off point for clothes to be donated to the South. So this was a real thing, and particularly in the years before the war. You read about this all the time, and Manisha's written about this more than I have.
Yeah, so, these sewing circles and these sewing anti-slavery societies are really interesting because you see the way they parlay ideas about domesticity and femininity to, make really public political claims. So they have the sewing circle, so they're doing that. They're producing stuff for the big anti-slavery fairs, and the anti-slavery bazaar in Boston is a huge thing. They bake goods, they sew stuff, they knit stuff, and they're very clever. They sell things to people, to college students on commencement, and these are very organized politically. And then Maria Chapman is the sort of general who sort of leads these anti-slavery bazaars. But besides just producing these goods and creating those conversation circles, they're a bit like those clubs that Margaret Fuller had, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton participated in Boston. And that's when she sort of really, comes into her own a little bit, long before the London Anti-Slavery Conference, before Lucretia Mott introduces her to Mary Wollstonecraft. So women's groups, whether they were clubs, intellectual clubs, or these sewing circles, were not just these sort of feminine spaces, they were political spaces, because they're, sending petitions. So the Dover Anti-Slavery Ladies Society is signing a petition against the domestic slave trade in Washington, D.C. And remember, women outsign men 2-1 in these abolitionist petitions. And that's why Southern congressmen are like, we're not going to look at abolitionist petitions. They're signed by these hoydenish women and uppity Black people and effeminate men, all the stereotypes that they could think about abolitionism. But the fact that these women, who are not, voting citizens, they are citizens, but they're not voting, are signing these petitions, shows you that these sewing circles are doing a lot besides just sewing goods. They are actually using it as a platform for political activism.
And they were national? Were they across the country?
Well, these were all local societies, and the women's female anti-slavery societies did meet 3 times in a kind of a national convention in Philadelphia, where all the female anti-slavery societies got together. But once the abolitionist movement split over the issue of women's rights, besides other issues of politics and religion, many of these female anti-slavery societies got integrated into those Garrisonian societies because they wanted to elect women as office members. And in fact, Abby Kelly Foster gets elected to the executive committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So even though the Boston and Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society persist, and there are some other female anti-slavery ladies society that joined the other organization and that are not very overt about their commitment to women's rights, and certainly, wanting to maintain a more ladylike presence within the abolition movement. That national meeting lapses after the late 1830s. They're then part of the Anti-Slavery Society, and they come together in integrated spaces. And increasingly in the 40s and 50s, people are saying these are promiscuous meetings because men and women, Black and white, are getting together and talking to each other. And, a lot of people are not very comfortable with that. Even these women's rights conventions, the only men that are there are abolitionist men. but they're seen as
troublemakers in the audience. People throwing Bibles at them and rocks and bricks and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. The clergymen are come out in force to oppose them. And one interesting incident when Henry Grew goes to sort of challenge a women's rights convention, and Lucretia Mott refers him to his daughter Mary Grew, who is the secretary of the NAACP Society and is very involved in women's rights. And he's rather shamefacedly sits down.
And new questions popped up. Can you discuss the role of religion in these three activists' lives? To what extent did religious connection and belief systems provide a pathway for sharing their causes and engaging others in activism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mentioned in passing that religion, almost all of these abolitionists were deeply religious. And they, interestingly, many of them were evangelical Christians. And at the time, evangelical Christians were what we today would be calling, came from the left, not from the right, which is sort of the stereotype today. So William Lloyd Garrison was very much, a part of the Second Great Awakening. And he believed that, and this is why one of the reasons they were so driven to do what they thought was right. And of course, Quakers, believed that slavery was a sin. And if you believed slavery was a sin, as these evangelical Christians did, then you had to act on your conscience. You had to object to it. You had to be true to your conscience. And so also in the 1820s and 1830s, as part of the Second Great Awakening, New York State was just swept by this movement, these revivalist camp meetings, from one end of the state to the other. And Auburn was right in the middle of the state. And there, Francis writes about how people were trying to convince them to come to camp meetings, and they were quite snobbish. They were, high church Episcopalians, and so they thought it was silly. But in fact, it wasn't silly. The middle-class women went to these meetings, and they were changed by it. They were allowed at these revival meetings. They were allowed to stand up and speak, as you would be allowed to in a Quaker meeting. You couldn't do that in your own church. And so they'd come home, and their husbands would be outraged. They were speaking back to them. And then the other thing that was preached at these meetings was that slavery was wrong. And so they called this whole band of Western and Central New York State the burned over district, because so many people were kind of burned up by the fires of evangelism.
Yeah, I mean, that is the sort of conventional narrative of the rise of abolition. I try to show a little bit in my book, Slave's Cause, that abolition and women's rights quickly grows out of that, that empire of religious benevolence and moral reform. The reason why Garrison is considered so radical is because he's constantly challenging the American church, the established church. And at one point, he even says, he quotes Thomas Paine and says, if the Bible defends slavery, then maybe we should give up the Bible. And the people are like, what? They're like completely astounded that he would say something like that. And so, these American tract societies, American Bible societies, American colonization society that wanted to colonize free blacks out of the United States, they all, the Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, they all came out of this sort of religious ferment, those camp revivals, the burnt over district, which was the upstate New York. Abolitionists, I find, become pretty iconoclastic quite fast. And this goes back to what Dorothy mentioned, the Protestant descended sects and the Quakers. And you're right, not all Quakers were abolitionists. And first, Quakers had to make their own society abolitionists. And a lot of those early Quaker abolitionists, like Benjamin Lay and etc., are trying to get rid of slaveholding in their own society first before they start preaching outside the Society of Friends. But the connection between religion and these radical social movements of the 19th century is interesting. And in the end, you have somebody like Garrison doing that, and then you have somebody like Stanton, who writes the Woman's Bible, because she's like, she's gotten so much opposition from clergymen and from the church, the established church. that she decides to do this. Also, Matilda Jocelyn Gage did that too. So it's interesting that their relationship to religion was a complex one. The textbook version that this just translated quickly, and I think abolition and women's rights are those two movements that end up questioning religious verities in a way that the temperance movement or the Grahamites and some of those other movements that existed at that time did not. And I think that's why they become so controversial, and that's why they're seen as radical at one point.
And there were debates. Sponsored by the American Anti-Slavery Society between conservative clergymen and radical clergymen, and some of those are quite, approach violence. People felt so deeply about one side or the other, and of course, very different interpretations of the Bible.
Right. And the denomination split. I mean, we still have that split. The reason why you have Southern Baptists and Southern Methodists is precisely because they split over slavery. You're right. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very intriguing comment to end on. So it's unfortunate we have to wrap up the conversation, and there's some really interesting comments in the chat section. But alas, all good things, we have to wrap up. So thank you so much to the two of you, really, for a really enlightening and engaging conversation on the many issues surrounding this period in American history and women's role in it. And I just want to thank you both on behalf of both the Mark Twain House and Museum and the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center for joining us. And if anyone would like to re-listen to the conversation, all of the Mark Twain House's virtual programs are posted on their website and will be available for you to watch. We are also including a couple of survey links. If folks in the audience would be interested in please giving us some feedback, it's always helpful for us for future programming. And you can check out events happening at both the Stowe Center and Mark Twain at both of our websites. And really, again, just many thanks for this really, really engaging conversation, and enjoying learning more about this really important topic in American history.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to talk to you, Manisha. Really, really interesting. Great book, too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to read your book, Dorothy. I enjoyed the conversation today and getting to know you virtually.
Yes, next time in person.
Hopefully. Yes. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
You too. And thanks for the audience, too.